Thank you for joining me in a conversation about 3 specific data skills that we can use in Excel or Google Sheets. The first thing that we're going to do is look at a data set that is similar to what we can get from diploma reports, PhD reports, and from our DDE in PowerSchool. And this is looking at a set of data where you have a lot of levels or layers or data points. So what we have here is an ID number, a student name, a school, a 30-1%, and their diploma mark that correlates. Now this is fake data, but it is very similar to what you would see in many of these different spreadsheets and tables. So the first skill to look at is making sure the data that we are investigating or looking at is clean and doesn't have any extra things in it. So what I first noticed about this is occasionally students don't complete a course and they're missing a data value like a diploma score. And so one of the key things you can do is look at this filter option under sort and filter. And if you do click that, there's an arrow drop down which you can click and uncheck anything that you don't want to see, like blanks. And if you do that, those blank values disappear and we can select only what we want. And we can insert a table or a graph or a chart or something from the Excel view. But one of the things that I'm going to do is click on just the data that we want and Control-C to copy. And I'm going to paste this into a Desmos graph, which looks something like this. And we can Control-V paste it. And with that, we can actually see all of these dots or data values are individual students and their input output 30-1 mark and how it correlates to a diploma mark. So this specific student right here had 45% in school in 30-1 and 52% on the diploma. All of these data points are students. This helps when there are hundreds or thousands of students and you want to visualize spread. Here's a student who may have got 65% in school and 34% on the diploma, and you can see how far they are away from kind of this middle line and how far that mark has dropped. So visualizing data is a benefit, but what we had here was initially 30-1 mark with a diploma. I'm going to move over to sheet 2 here, and with sheet 2, and we'll do something new here. So I'm going to clear, so under sort, I'm going to clear those filters and get back to a clean data set. Under sheet 2, what we have is a very similar export, maybe from our stored grades or from a place where we've got information, but we've got information elsewhere and we want to merge the two tables or we want to bring together something. So what we have here is, again, student ID number, a name, a school again, and a math 20-1%. But what often happens in most of school is there's only one data point. And so we don't always have this 30-1 in school and 30-1 diploma. We've got only a final mark for 20-1. But sometimes we ask the question, how does this correlate to this? How does 20-1 correlate to 30-1 diploma mark? Is there a correlation? Or how does 20-1 correlate to 30-2? Or is there a correlation between attendance and success? Sometimes we want to correlate two data sets together. And so what we're going to do in this example is we're going to look at how can we pull in the 30-1 diploma mark from the other spreadsheet in sheet 1. How can we pull that into this table? And we're going to do that with one very specific formula called a VLOOKUP. A VLOOKUP has 4 parts to it. So we're going to enter into the place that we're hoping for the information to result. And we're going to ask to equals, starts a formula, VLOOKUP. And we're going to open up a parentheses or bracket. And we're going to ask for 4 things here. The first thing that we're going to look for is what we want to match in the two tables. Sometimes a name is okay, but sometimes two students have the same name, so it's sometimes best to use a unique identifier like an ID number. So equals VLOOKUP. I'm going to click on this ID number to say, I want to find this ID number in the other table. So then we're going to say, comma. That's the first part. Next, we're going to go to sheet 1 and we're going to say, where do we want to look? And I want to look in the entire table for that connector and the information. So I actually select all of that table. and I actually already see that ID number 157, the diploma mark is a 90. So I'm expecting a 90 to show up at the end of this. It is in the first, second, third, fourth, fifth kind of column of this table. So I said, I want to find 151. I want to find the ID number. I want to look in this table, comma, and the third part is saying, if you find it, what should we pull out? And we're going to ask for the comma fifth column. So ID number was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is the diploma. So we're going to pull out the fifth column value, comma, and the last thing is a true or a false. Do we want an approximate match or an exact match? An approximate match might say, if you find the number 1 or 15 or 156, is that okay? No, we want to be exact, and we want to say false. We want this to be an exact match, and we hit enter. And of course, that 90 diploma mark does come out. So what we're going to do is we're going to drag this down, but one of the things that we have to be very careful about is, and if I click on this formula again, that our table doesn't change. And one of the things that I'm noticing as I click through these is we are continuing to look for the ID number on the far side, which is great. As we drag this down, it's continuing to look for a different ID number. But the problem is this table is also shifting down. It's looking in B4. It's looking in B5. It's looking in B6. So we're going to use some dollar signs around our B. So always start in the top left, B2, and always end in this, it was F15, dollar sign around that F, to say lock in this table in this one place so it doesn't shift down and we're always looking in that table. So I'm now going to lock in that table location, fill down, and what you're going to notice is it's now connecting those two pieces of information. So for example, it found ID number 756 and it pulled out the fifth value, the fifth column, which was a 72, and it just kind of continues. And if you fill all the way down, we could now do 23 values, or we could do 1,000 in just as much time. A really quick way of actually doing this as well, if I delete all of these except for that top one, is if you hover in that bottom right corner of that cell where that plus sign is and you're going to be filling down, you can actually double click and it'll fill down everything all at once. So what we now have is a connection between 20-1 mark and from a different table, a corresponding 30-1 diploma mark. And I could have asked for column 4, and instead of pulling out the diploma mark, I could have pulled out their school awarded mark. But we're looking for the diploma mark, so we'll go back. So we now have, again, a correlation between two things. Like we did before, we're going to go to this filter, and we're going to get rid of these zeros, which may have been some weird placeholder, get rid of these NAs, which says there's no information there. It couldn't find a part of a formula. And now I have very clean data to say, for these students, this is how they did when they did in 20-1 and how they did on the 30-1 diploma. Now the VLOOKUP formula does pull the first time it finds that ID number. So if a student took a course more than once, it is going to be finding that first time they took a course. So copy the data, and if we wanted, make a visualization in Excel or go to Desmos, and once again, I'm going to visualize this with a Control V, paste that information in, and what we have here is how a student did in 20-1 and how they did on the diploma in 30-1. So all of these correspond to a relationship between 20-1 and 30-1 diploma, which is kind of cool. The last thing that we're going to do, the third thing for today, as we maybe clean this back up and remove these filters, is we're going to look at this new data set which has a bunch of things in it, 20-1, 30-1. There's also school names, and there's student names, and there's ID numbers. And we're going to do something called a pivot table to consolidate some information. And so we're going to click Insert, Pivot Table. And we're going to say OK when it asks to generate a pivot table from the information it sees. And I was clicked somewhere on that table, so it's just going to use the information in that table. if I wasn't clicked on that table, you might have a bit of a problem. So let's click OK. And we don't see a table show up because we actually, in our fields on the far right, have to ask what we want to see. Now for this, let's inquire if we were trying to compare schools and how there is a correlation between percent in diploma and success. So I'm going to click on school and drag it into this rows. Now there are filters, which we can say be careful with zeros, be careful with certain values, or schools we don't want to see. And like if I wanted, I could say, again, I'm seeing some values, and I could say something like, I don't want to see BevFacey, so I can uncheck BevFacey and click OK, and that disappeared from our rows. So I will include it again, and it pops back in. So what I want to do is I want to look at the values. I'm not going to produce rows and columns here. I'm just going to produce some values that will show up across these rows here. So I'm going to drag in 20-1%, and it says sum of math 20-1%. Now I don't really want to see a sum of all these marks. I want to see click on it, value field settings. I want to see an average of these values. So for this group of our Drawson students, I'm seeing an average of those 20-1 marks, which is 64.5%. I'm going to drag in 30-1 diploma mark after this, and I'm going to change it from counting the number of students, which is valuable, to say something like class size. I'm going to change the value field settings to an average, and now I can actually see here's the average of those 30-1 marks. And we can, again, if we really wanted, we can again drag in and look at a count. So you can say, well, this is how many students are actually being included in this data. So with this 30-1 mark, I'm going to uncheck this. I'm going to click on this arrow drop down, and I'm going to get rid of these zeros. I'm a little bit nervous to include a zero in these calculations. That might really skew what the actual student averages are. And I'm going to get rid of these NAs, and I'm going to drag those diploma marks that I filtered out. You can see there is some filtering that's been happening. I'm going to drag that into the filters column, and you'll see those filters impact those scores. It was trying to average numbers with NAs, and it was trying to use the zeros as a part of student marks. So that feels a little bit better. So what we have is 2 students in our Drawson. Their 20-1 average was 64.5%. Their average in 30-1 on the diploma was 61%. And again, that was 2 students. Not a lot of students, but you could imagine if there was 500 or 1,000 or 10,000 students, all of this could happen instantaneously. Again, you can filter, you can do lots of different things. You can again say, what is the equals? If I say C4 minus B4, I can have the spread between those, which is sometimes more valuable when you look at 30-1 to 30-1 diploma or school awarded to final, and you can start to see some of those values as they either stand out or don't. Again, this data is all fake, but you can see the impact of bringing together 2 tables and then ultimately looking at a pivot table as a way of consolidating mass amounts of information.